Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bharti, and we are here at Open Source Summit in Dublin. And today we have with us Gabriele, Columbro. First of all, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here.
We are here at the Open Source Summit. First of all, tell us a bit about the keynotes were there, and you folks also made an additional announcement here. So let's talk about your own experience at this event.
Yeah, I mean, it's been an amazing day for us. We have unveiled a brand new entity, Linux Foundation Europe. Linux Foundation Europe, and I've been, appointed as the general manager for Linux Foundation Europe. I'm originally Italian, although I'm based in California. But we are extremely excited to be able to invest on the European continent and collaboration in Europe. Indeed, the Linux Foundation already has a major presence in Europe in terms of members, projects, and staff, but this allows us to really focus on the problems and challenges of open source collaboration in Europe. So pretty big news, and together with it, we announced also our first project out of LF Europe. It's called the Open Wallet Foundation. It was announced this morning, as well as we actually unveiled the World of Open Source 2022 Europe Spotlight Research. Is the first European regional specific piece of research, which is going to be an amazing resource for me as I plan the go-to-market for Linux Foundation Europe. So exciting times.
When you said that Linux Foundation already has a presence in Europe, but why you felt there was a need to create a separate, sister organization for the foundation?
That's a really important question. So there's one primary reason, and I think a couple of additional reasons. The primary reason is, if you think about Europe, it is the only region where you have a supranational entity, the European Union, that really, on one hand, drives shared goals across multiple nation states, as well as defines very particular rules of the road for how collaboration between these states can happen, as well as how intellectual property flows across the member states. And so, first and foremost, we wanted to make sure that we would create an entity that it's based in Belgium, based in Europe, that becomes a sort of regional asset owner for the projects that we want to start here. Secondly, you made a very valid point. Europe is unique and different from the United States and from other regions of the world in their approach of open source. First of all, there is a massive grassroots community. An Open Forum report from last year talked about over 250,000 contributors in Europe. Secondly, from a policy standpoint, Europe has been a leader in open source adoption, open source contribution, but also, to your point, policies that are sort of forward-thinking, like GDPR. In California, I live in California, and we have CCPA, which is very much almost like a copy-paste of GDPR. And so there is a lot of, innovative, socially oriented policies that come out of Europe, and we think the open source can really provide sort of a bridge between the public sector, the private sector, and the individuals. Last reason, we have come across more and more projects that are either focused on a specific regulation or problem that is European, or that they have a large representation of sort of European organizations as starting members of that organization. And therefore, perception-wise as well, it does make sense to be able to stand up projects in the European territory, potentially even to access alternative sorts of funding, like, for example, European grants, which is something that, of course, is reserved to collaborations and projects and companies that are based in Europe. And so I think if you put the three things together, you'll see why we created what we would call an entry point, a European entry point to the Linux Foundation Federation. I want to be clear, this is not going to be a silo. We don't want to fragment the ecosystem. If there's anything that open source can do, as we know, is build bridges across regions, countries, industries, competitors. So the Linux Foundation Europe, I think, offers almost like a springboard for projects to start local and then make it on a global scale through the Linux Foundation sort of global platform. In fact, our tagline is collaborate locally, innovate globally.
You talked about some of the projects that you announced. I would like to go a bit deeper into those projects, which you feel are like, you talked about the Spotlight research and you talked about a little project as well. So from your perspective, which projects are the priority that you will be focusing on?
One of the reasons why I brought FINOS to the Linux Foundation 2 years ago was really to be able to access this amazing set of services that the Linux Foundation provides, including training, events, and most recently, research. So when we were building up to the launch of Linux Foundation Europe, in May, specifically in KubeCon in Valencia, I believe you were there, we announced our first European-specific research. And we actually coined a new framework, the World of Open Source moniker for this type of research. And it's not a secret that one of the reasons why I sponsored this research was because I really wanted Linux Foundation Europe to be data-driven. I didn't have the luxury of being based on data in my previous sort of startup efforts. And this is a unique position that I'm in. So we certainly have priorities, and I'm going to talk about them in terms of how we execute and how we involve the community. But when you think about what are we going to collaborate on, as I said this morning in my keynote, our community is the roadmap. The data that we are uncovering is going to drive the operations of Linux Foundation Europe. So based on that, I would say first and foremost, our next 6 months are going to be about research and learning, both from the current data that we have and from the community. In fact, we will be creating an advisory board for European members to help us really focus on which areas we want to collaborate on. But secondly, in terms of the projects that we launched, in terms of actual projects and areas of collaboration, the Open Wallet Foundation is the first project. Very interesting project to build a engine for digital identity and digital wallet that actually can compete with the existing sort of dominant players in the space. So once again, creating a level playing field. We've had some really interesting support from, financial institutions, automotive, healthcare. So this is, I think, a really exciting project for sort of being the first that the Linux Foundation Europe launches. And we just put out our intent to form today. When I look beyond that, there is another confidential project, unfortunately, that I cannot share with you that will be released a little bit later in the year. But more broadly, when I think about the research and what it has uncovered and how it is impacting our strategy, I think the first and foremost pillar is actually to increasingly work and include the public sector in the conversation. I think the Linux Foundation, as you mentioned, has done a fantastic job over the years at bringing together fierce competitors or counterparts to collaborate on software whereby it was unthinkable even a few years ago. Not only that, but to really bring the individual contributors. I guess let's not forget that open source comes from individuals. I mentioned this morning the romantic view of open source in my keynote and how that is more prominent and prevalent in Europe than necessarily in the United States. This is one of the interesting qualitative results from our research. And so the Linux Foundation has been able over the years to really marry the commercial interest with individual contributors' interest and create a level playing field through open governance. I think as we invest into Europe, a third major actor has to be the public sector. the public sector, not just in terms of transparency or reuse, but really to use their convening power to drive innovation, collective value, solving European problems by bringing all the constituents together, individuals, industry, and the public sector itself. So this is really, I think, the main outcome from some of the research that is informing our go-to-market. The public sector does love open source here, but they're not using it to the full extent to actually drive consolidation or innovation.
When we look at LF Europe, is it, as you said, this is not silos, but is it a kind of entity which is parallel to Linux Foundation US? Because when we look at Linux Foundation, it's not a foundation. I call it the United States of projects. There are projects within Linux Foundation. So is the Linux Foundation Europe just another project, or it's a sister organization, and you will have a lot of other projects within Linux Foundation Europe which will cater to the local market depending on the need?
I think you nailed the definition of the Linux Foundation. We actually sell, you call them the United States, we call them the Linux Foundation Federation. Mm-hmm. So I think the best way to your question, to be very specific in the answer, it's the latter. Linux Foundation Europe, consider it as a separate entry point to the Linux Foundation Federation. More than necessarily a hierarchy or sibling versus parent or child, it really allows two things. Our members can come from Linux Foundation US and then join Linux Foundation Europe for free through reciprocal membership. But they can also come from Linux Foundation Europe, be billed in euros. There is a parity of fees, also because the exchange rate is pretty close to 1:1 right now. And then you can join the Linux Foundation at no cost, and no additional cost. So from a membership standpoint, they're really sort of just two parallel entry points. From a project standpoint, you're absolutely right. As we come across more opportunities to stand up projects that are specific to a European problem, or that require European funding, or that have a major representation of initial founding members from Europe, that is exactly the point of LF Europe, being able to create and incorporate that project under the Linux Foundation Europe entity. And therefore, yes, to your point, the Linux Foundation Europe itself, it will become, from a legal standpoint, it will be able to host multiple projects exactly like the Linux Foundation itself does. But again, we're not going to create a separate silo. We're not going to create, say, its own governing board or its own board of directors. We will have an advisory board because we want to make sure that Europe has a voice on the global stage. But really, ultimately, the Linux Foundation Federation landscape of projects is going to be the, union, the combination of the Linux Foundation US or global and the Linux Foundation Europe project. So I think the answer is a bit of both.
Bit of both, yeah. So second part of the question was also there will be a lot of projects which can be part of Linux Foundation Europe because they are too special local. And another beauty of Linux Foundation is that you folks have such a great kind of model for governance that projects can very easily embrace and adopt. They don't have to go out. So even if you do create a foundation within Linux Foundation Europe, they can just but then they can still leverage all the marketing, all the all the resources that are there.
And you actually make a very good point. As part of launching, if you go to linuxfoundation.eu, which is the newly launched Linux Foundation Europe website, you'll find not only information on how to join, how to host the project, our over 15 inaugural members, but you'll also find that we put together policies that are specific to Europe, as well as project governance templates that are specific to Linux Foundation Europe. Now, let me be clear here. Those project templates, governance templates, open governance templates are very much based on the ones that have proven to be successful for now over 2 decades in Linux Foundation collaborations. I mean, in a way, That's almost like the secret sauce of the Linux Foundation.
Which is not that
being
secret.
able to exactly, not so secret as it's
Open source, you can say open
exactly, the open source, I
Yeah.
guess. But open source, that's an interesting.
Open source and open source, yeah, that's
we
actually
talk about that. Yeah, that's the way I think to encapsulate years of experience in building successful collaborations in the open, and sort of take that and templatize it for Europe as well, without, to your point, reinventing the wheel. And yeah, I think the second point that you made that is super important, regardless whether the project is stood up under LF or LF Europe, there is the whole set of horizontal services like training, event, marketing, research, crowdfunding, LFX platform, all of those will be, of course, across any project in any of the entities of the Linux Foundation.
One more thing is, since you mentioned training and I think every time I talk to any folks, I always ask question, hey, so okay, this is available in English, but you are also catering to the global audience.
Yes.
Which does also mean that a lot of Linux Foundation projects like lab training, and certification, or so that also means that there will be kind of European version as well, so that it's more catered to the because timing becomes an issue. If somebody is sitting here at different odd hours, there are different hours, so you will also kind of localize a lot of
So it's a good question. I think there's a couple of answers there. One, from a mere language localization standpoint, that's certainly one of the things that we've done for our website differently than before. The website is in English, Italian, Spanish, French, and German. From a training standpoint, it's a really good question. I think this is an area that I will be exploring in 2023, pending resources, but even just taking existing trainings and translating it, localizing it in different languages could be already valuable. Whether we will be producing new training and new certifications that are specific to Europe or to LF Europe, I think it largely depends to the projects that we stand up. So as you know, again, the Linux Foundation, most of the real work happens at project level. We are, to your point, United States of projects. And so, take an example, Open Wallet Foundation. Yeah, if this project takes off and, it will require training, it will require certification, of course, we will be, producing so. But I do think that there is an element of, including Europe more, even from a language perspective, and really just translating, making the effort and the investment to translate a lot of the material that is currently just in English. We know that is a barrier in some of the, especially Southern Europe states. I come from Italy, and it's still a bit of a novelty to speak proper English in my country.
Gabriele, thank you so much for taking time out today and talk about, of course, the Linux Foundation Europe and FINOS project. And I would love to have you back on the show, maybe in person or remotely, but I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me here, and I hope to be here with you again, either in Dublin or I'll see you in California maybe.